Under no circumstances can the Jets run it back with Aaron Rodgers and Davante Adams in 2025. You understand that, right? Well, evidently some Jets fans don't. So we're going to explain why Rodgers and Adams cannot return next season today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Tuesday, December 17th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Aaron Rodgers and Davante Adams cannot return to the Jets in 2025. I thought that was a pretty uncontroversial statement. I think before Sunday, it was a pretty uncontroversial statement in the fan base. But evidently, Sunday's game has changed a lot of minds. Yesterday, I began the show by jokingly asking if we could all agree that a narrow win over 3-10 Jacksonville should change nothing about the Jets' strategy going forward. I thought we all agreed. But then I looked online, particularly at a video Woody Johnson posted of Rodgers throwing a big pass to Adams in Sunday's game. And almost every reply was, run it back. It's so obvious, run it back. And I'm sitting there saying, how is it so obvious? To me, it's obvious that the Jets cannot run it back. And I feel like I've done this show over and over. I feel like every week or two, we do a show and we explain why Aaron Rodgers cannot come back next season. And I don't think one game can change everything. And I do think that there is a danger in the NFL, because there's only 17 games, because you only play one game a week, of overreacting to one singular result. I think that there is a real danger in being a prisoner of the moment when you're an NFL fan. And let me explain to you why I say that. On my website, GangGreenNation.com, every week we do a survey. The company I work for is called SB Nation. So they do this survey every week. It's called SB Nation Reacts. And we ask Jets fans their opinions on various aspects of the team. So I usually come up with a question. Then we ask a question about the fan base's overall confidence level in the team. And it's amazing how much opinions change over the course of a week. You know, 1 week, 60% of the Jets fan base will say that they're confident in the team's direction. The next week, if they lose a game, it'll go down to like 20. But there are also individual questions that really illuminate this. Right after the Jets beat New England in week 3, I asked a question, do you approve of the job Robert Saleh is doing as Jets head coach? 70% said yes. After the New England game, 70% said that they approve of the job Saleh is doing as Jets head coach. 2 weeks later, Saleh was fired. 2 weeks. 57% of people said they agreed with that. Of course, what followed after the New England game was a bad loss to Denver and an ugly loss to the Vikings in London. Then the Jets lose 3 games in a row. 3 weeks later, we asked, was firing Saleh the right move? Only 21% said yes. So I mean, think about that. Think about how short of a span that is. We went from 70% approving of Saleh to 57% saying he should be fired in 2 weeks to only 21% saying he should be fired 3 weeks later after the Jets lose games. Did that much change about Saleh? Now, I understand that, a loss can make you frustrated. I understand that opinions can change on a coach over time, but should in 2 weeks, you really go from saying this guy's doing a good job to he deserved to be fired? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But I think sometimes what happens is we view the latest thing that's happened as the only important thing, as the only data point, when in reality, the best way to analyze the team is to look as broadly as possible, take as wide of a view as possible at how players have performed and how the team has performed. Now, Sunday's win was an excellent performance by Aaron Rodgers, and it was a stellar performance by Davante Adams. I mean, that was one of the best games I've ever seen a wide receiver play. I keep saying on this show, Davante Adams isn't what he used to be in Green Bay. I need to revisit that, because Davante Adams is the last couple of weeks. Davante Adams has been playing phenomenal football. That's not taking away anything from them, but we don't always need to come up with a sweeping conclusion whenever something happens on the football field. Sometimes you just say good job. That doesn't mean you have to change your entire plan, because otherwise you become one of the people that said Robert Saleh is doing a great job to he deserved to be fired to he didn't deserve to be fired in the span of 6 weeks. You have to take a wide view of this. And I think any objective view of this would the current Jets team is that this team's just not very good. And while Adams is playing well, Rodgers' performance over the course of the season has simply not been good. And, we go through these stats like every week. This week, he's 28th in completion percentage, tied for 24th in yards per attempt, 18th in passer rating, 22nd in QBR. He's been good the last 2 weeks, but over the course of the long season, he has not been good. And I think if you look at this team, it's very difficult to find a path for the Jets to make the Super Bowl next season. And if you're going to bring back a 41-year-old quarterback who will turn 42 in the season, and a 32-year-old receiver who will turn 33 in the season, there has to be a viable path to the Super Bowl, because financially, these are enormous commitments to these players. I mean, Rodgers if you bring Rodgers back next season, you add another $37.5 million to what he needs to be paid. The Jets already have a tab on him. Jets already have money that they'll have to pay him after he leaves, or money he'll have to account for on the salary cap after he leaves. You add to that tab next season if he returns. And Adams has an enormous $38.3 million cap hit if he returns next season. I mean, do you really want to bring guys back who are that old when your team doesn't have a realistic path to the Super Bowl? And I think it's very difficult to argue the Jets have a realistic path to the Super Bowl. Because while Adams is still playing at a high level, at some point age kicks in. We saw it with Tyron Smith. Tyron Smith went from playing at a second team All-Pro level last year to, being a guy who was a low-level starter this year. At some point, age does catch up to you, especially at a position where athleticism is paramount at like wide receiver. And for Rodgers, we've seen age catch up to him. These two games don't eliminate what's happened before. And I know some people are now going to say that, oh, well, he was just injured before. Okay, well, let's think about what that really means. Because if Rodgers was injured this year, and he probably was, well, he was injured last year, and 2 years ago he was injured. I mean, 2 years ago in 2022, he had what was then the worst season of his career, and the excuse I kept hearing was, well, he was injured all season long. Then last year he missed the entire season from an injury. This year he was banged up. Did it decrease his level of play? I would say yes. But that's kind of a feature of Aaron Rodgers right now. Aaron Rodgers is 41. He's going to be 42 next year. It's not an accident he keeps getting injured late in his career. The body is not as durable when you hit the 40s as it was in the 30s, or especially the 20s. Rodgers is also, Rodgers' body also just doesn't. He's been open about this. His body does not respond. He doesn't recover the way he used to. So I don't think you can look at this and just say, oh, well, Rodgers was injured this year, and he'll be healthy next year. Well, he hasn't been healthy in about 3-4 years. And his play has been on a steady decline over the last 3-4 years. At some point, age kicks in. It has with Rodgers. It will with Adams. And if the Jets were, having a good season, if the Jets were one of the top seeds in the AFC right now, this would be different. We could talk about running it back because the Jets would have a realistic path to the Super Bowl. But if you're dealing with a 41 to 42-year-old quarterback and a 32 to 33-year-old receiver, can you really justify $75 million of cap space to those guys when you don't have a realistic path to the Super Bowl? I mean, what's the argument for it? I understand why people want to bring Adams back because he's playing at such a high level. I don't understand as much why people want to bring Rodgers back, but I guess maybe it's like he's played well the last 2 weeks, so people are maybe reading a little bit too much into that. But looking at this objectively, I mean, again, Adams' $38.3 million cap hit. Jets save $30 million of that against the cap. Jets create $30 million of cap space if he's gone. And this is a team that doesn't have a lot of cap space. And it's a team that has a lot of needs heading into the offseason. And Rodgers, well, it goes even deeper because you talk about the hold he's over this franchise, the number of moves this team has made because he's here, the level of destruction that this has caused on the personnel front. And I'm not saying he's the one that decided these things, but I'm saying the Jets made a lot of bad decisions based on the premise Rodgers could still play at a high level when he couldn't. It's pretty clear that these are guys who cannot return to this team next season. And part of the reason is that this Jets team just is not very good. Ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to talk about this false narrative that's going around the fan base right now about where the team is good and where the team is bad. And we're going to explain why it's false. That's ahead here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is focused on togetherness this holiday season. That means when you bring people together at live events, the experience is that much better, and it's the perfect gift. Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. I've used Game Time myself to get tickets. It's really convenient app to use. A couple clicks and you've got amazing deals. You know what else I really like? I really like their all-in pricing because sometimes you go on you're buying tickets and there are all these hidden fees. Well, with Game Time's all-in pricing, they show you exactly what you're going to pay. There's no surprises when you check out. The other thing I like is the view from your seat. They show you a picture of what it's going to look like from your seat, so that there's again no surprises when you get to your venue. Game Time's my go-to place for buying tickets. You want to go see Jets Rams this weekend? Game Time's the place to get in on the action. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL. LOCKEDONNFL, one word with no space for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game Time. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is also brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 to get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Looking at this coming weekend, Jets are hosting the Los Angeles Rams, a Rams team that's playing very good football as of late. Jets are 3-point underdogs at home. I think that sounds pretty fair to me, but if you think the Jets are going to win, FanDuel is the place to get in on the action because you get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet at FanDuel.com. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the National Football League. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you, everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. We're talking about why the Jets cannot run it back with Aaron Rodgers and Davante Adams in 2025. I thought this was settled. We've talked about this a lot. It feels like every week or two we're doing a show with this topic, but one win against Jacksonville apparently has changed everything and has made people think that the Jets, there's some viable path for the Jets to bring Rodgers and Adams back. I think it's an overreaction to one game. And as I mentioned, there was one particular thing that really struck my attention is all the people when Woody Johnson sent out a video on his Twitter account of Rodgers hitting Adams for a deep ball. The response was all run it back, run it back, run it back. And one guy said, it's simple. You run it back. Another said, it's easy. You fix the defense. The offense is good. And let me go back to something I said in the first segment. You can't be a prisoner of the moment when you break down the NFL. You can't view the last game as the only thing that matters. Really, the biggest sample size you can get is the most accurate sample size because it shows you good games, bad games. It shows you everything. Anybody can run into a great game. There are guys who've never amounted to much in the NFL, but they had one huge game. Sometimes fluky things happen in a one game scenario. Sometimes you just face a really bad opponent, which, by the way, is what the Jets did on Sunday. The Jacksonville defense is horrendous. Sometimes a guy just gets into a good matchup one-on-one. A receiver just faces a corner he can beat, who's just stylistically a bad matchup for him. An offensive lineman faces a defensive end who just isn't that good. Sometimes they're fluky things happen. Sometimes it's game conditions. A rainy field changes everything. Sometimes it's just luck. A ball bounces your way, and you end up having a big statistical day. Sometimes you're just feeling it. And the reverse is true also. Sometimes you just run into a really bad matchup. Sometimes you run into a great team that it makes you look worse than you really are. Sometimes a ball bounces the other guy's way. One game is not a way to judge a team. One game is not a way to judge a player. And I went through Rodgers' stat. Now, Adams is having a really good season. So the issues with Adams are more financial than they are his playing ability. But let's talk about some of the comments, because some of the comments I've seen online over the last day or two is that suggest that the Jets' only problem is defense. The offense is in really good shape. And again, let's take a look at the 30,000 foot perspective of this, because people are saying that the offense is good and the defense is the only reason they're losing. Well, the Jets are 22nd in scoring offense and 18th in scoring defense. So right there, it tells you that the Jets defense is better than the offense. The Jets defense relative to the rest of the league is better than the offense. Because again, Jets 22nd most points or average points per game, 18th in average points allowed per game. Does that suggest to you that the defense is the only problem? Now, it suggests the defense is a problem. The defense has definitely trended downwards since the firing of Robert Saleh. But You can't sit there and tell me the defense is the only problem. The offense is great, because the offense is worse relative to the rest of the league than the defense is. It's not like the offense is producing big numbers in other areas. Jets are only 19th in yards per play. They're 17th in yards per rush. They're 21st in net yards per pass. So the passing game's been behind the run game. And yeah, like that includes the big game that Rodgers and Adams had on Sunday. You can say, well, Davante Adams hasn't been here the whole year. Well, he's been here most of the year. And that includes the big game, but it also includes all the other games. You have to take as wide of a lens as possible to evaluate the team. The way people are talking, you'd think they were the Cincinnati Bengals. The Cincinnati Bengals are a team with an excellent offense, the 5th best scoring offense in the league. And they have a positive point differential. The Jets, again, they have the 22nd best scoring offense in the league. And they're below average in yards per play. They're below average in yards per rush. They're below average in net yards per pass. There's nothing good about this football team. The Jets have a bad offense. They have a bad defense. They have a bad special teams. They have bad coaching. There's nothing good about this football team. And that brings me back to a point that I made in the first segment. It'd be one thing if this team could win a championship next year, if there was a viable path to this team winning a championship. But there isn't, because it's not the case where the offense is great and the defense is holding them back. Every single unit on this team is holding them back. That includes the coaching, which is horrible. Now, maybe we can improve the coaching next year, but running back the same pieces on offense, that's not going to fix the offense. It's not going to fix the 22nd score, the number 22 scoring offense in the league. The defense has a lot of parts that are missing, especially on the defensive line, and they're going to have to figure out the corner situation because DJ Reed's a free agent. What's going on with Michael Carter II, who's really not having a very good season, and neither is Sauce Gardner. And the safety position's a mess on defense. I guess maybe special teams is a little bit more fixable, but it's not like this is a Super Bowl team. It's not like a team it's not like a team that's a Super Bowl team, because this Jets team is just not very good. They've been outscored by 42 points. The Bengals have a positive point differential. That shows you that they're probably a little unlucky. That shows you they're a team that can flash dominance, but just has had some bad luck in close games, and they're also the fifth best scoring offense in the league, which shows you if they fix their defense, they might be right there. Jets are not that. Jets are bad across the board. Jets have been outscored by 42 points. And yeah, okay, the Jets are 3-7 in one-score games. So let's say they go 500. That's a little bit of bad luck, but it's the type of bad luck that takes you from 6-8 to 4-10. If the Jets had a 500 record in one-score games, they'd be 6-8 right now. They'd still be far outside the playoff race. So you can't look at this and say that the Jets are a team that's close. That's just not true. It's just there's just really no way you can say that the Jets are close to being a Super Bowl team. And you have to look at the implications, because what are the odds the Jets can microwave a contender over the course of one offseason? Well, they've been trying to do that for 2 years, and look at what the results have been. It's really hard to do. So with Rodgers, if you bring him back next season, he counts for $23.5 million against the cap in 2025. Then $65 million, then $63 million in 2026. So 23.5 next year, $63 million in 2026. You get rid of him this offseason, he retires this offseason, or you cut him, it's just $49 million. You're done. Yeah. It's either $49 million this year or 23.5 next year and 63 in 2026. You really think that there's a good enough chance for the Jets to win the Super Bowl to bring him back at that price when you're adding so much to the future? Because Jets can't, no matter what happens, 2025 is going to be a lean year. It's going to be a tough year for the Jets because they've made too many missteps over the last 2 years. They've pretty much torpedoed their 2025 by making terrible decision after terrible decision in 2023 and 2024. The question is, do you want to bring this into 2026? Because the Jets spend 1 year unclogging their cap. In 2026, they'll be in fighting shape. And the new GM will be able to make moves to try and get this team to the playoffs. If you bring Rodgers back, then you have a $63 million bill due in 2026. Now, you can do some maneuvering to get that split over 2 years, but do you really want $63 million hanging over this team 2 years from now? Do you think that's a really good use of allocation based on what we've seen from Aaron Rodgers this year? I would have to argue no. I'd also have to argue that you're really tying the hands of the new general manager if you do that, because the new GM is going to inherit a situation where no matter what they do in 2025, whether you bring Rodgers and Adams back or not, you're going to have issues. You're probably not going to be able to build a winning team. But you have a chance in 2026 if you just spend 2025 as your reset year. Delaying this 1 year just hurts the team going forward. It doesn't really make your team more likely to win. I've heard people argue, well, you can make the playoffs in 2025. What are you basing that on? The team's 4-10 this year. We're gonna run back a 4-10 team. And by the way, a 4-10 team, 3 of their wins are against New England, Tennessee, and Jacksonville. 3 of the worst teams in the league. Three teams that are 3-11 right now. So it's not like this is a good, not like this is the hidden giants. This is a really bad football team. I don't understand the argument to run it back. All you're doing is hurting the next GM. We don't know who the next GM is going to be yet. But ahead, you're on the Locked On Jets podcast. We'll talk about the latest candidate. There was another GM candidate who interviewed with the team yesterday, a guy with an interesting resume. We'll talk about who that is and why he might be a fit as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by the College Football Playoff on TNT. It's that time of year. The College Football Playoff is back. And with the newly expanded 12-team format, it's guaranteed to be bigger and better than ever, bringing you all the hard-hitting and high-flying excitement that you love. TNT Sports' coverage of the College Football Playoff begins December 21st, starting with the College Football Playoff kickoff shows presented by AT&T at 11 a.m. Eastern, leading into our first matchup, the Southern Methodist University Mustangs versus the Penn State Nittany Lions at noon. Then the Clemson Tigers look to upset the Texas Longhorns in the showdown at 4 p.m. Eastern. Don't miss a moment of the action. Watch the College Football Playoff presented by Allstate live on TNT, True TV, TBS, and Max. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Tuesday. Let's turn our attention now to the Jets general manager search. Back in November, the Jets announced that they were hiring the 33rd Team, which is a football website, to help them conduct their search. Former Jets general manager Mike Tannenbaum and former Vikings general manager Rick Spielman were going to be the two people assisting the Jets with their search for a new general manager. Then there were a couple of weeks of quiet where nothing really happened. And it seems like the Jets were kind of gathering their thoughts. They were coming up with some candidates, making their list. Then the last couple of days, we started to get some news on some of the candidates. One was former Titans general manager John Robinson. Another is ESPN analyst Louis Riddick. And yesterday, the team announced that it completed an interview with former Falcons general manager Thomas Dimitroff. Now, Dimitroff was Atlanta's GM for quite a while. He served as the Falcons general manager from 2008 through 2020. And during that time, he assembled a record of 113-95, which is pretty solid, especially when you consider Falcons franchise history. Before Dimitroff arrived, Falcons kind of had a Jets-like history of futility. So the fact he was able to build them into a team that won pretty consistently, I would say that that's a positive. During his tenure, the Falcons almost won the Super Bowl in 2016. In fact, I think you can make an argument that Dimitroff built a Super Bowl winning team, because when the team's in the Super Bowl and they're up 28-3 and they blow the lead, it's not really the GM's fault that they blew the lead. He built a team that got out to the 28-3 lead in the Super Bowl. It's the players and the coaches who lost that game for them. So, Dimitroff built a championship level team in 2016, and there were 2 other years. The Falcons had first round buys. They were at the top of the NFC. So clearly, the guy who's built some very good teams. The record's a little mixed. If you look at the draft record, there were some excellent picks. Matt Ryan was his first draft pick in 2008. They drafted Ryan 3rd overall. Back in 2011, the Falcons made a big trade up. They traded up from the bottom of the first round, gave up multiple first round picks to get Julio Jones. I remember I was actually at that draft. I remember saying to my colleagues, that trade is either a genius move or Dimitroff just got himself fired. As we know, it was a genius move because Julio Jones turned into an excellent player. Other good picks include Desmond Trufant, Jake Matthews, Grady Jarrett in the 5th round in 2015. And then some moves that weren't so good. There's a couple guys on the 2024 Jets. Tack McKinley was a first-round pick in 2017. Isaiah Oliver was a second-round pick in 2018. So, like any GM is going to have bad draft picks on their record. But if you look at Dimitroff, there's more good than bad. He's built a number of really good teams with Atlanta. And I started thinking yesterday about the traits I'd want in an ideal general manager candidate. And you got to be careful with this because sometimes, you come up with these resume points and the candidate you get is horrible. Like I remember in 2019, everybody said with the Jets, well, we want a coach with an offensive background. We want a guy who's an experienced head coach. Well, the Jets got that in Adam Gase. So you got to be careful when you do these points as like, we want this and this and this. We want this guy to have this resume point and that resume point and that resume point. Because sometimes you don't get a great candidate. But I think that broadly you can think about what you want. And I was thinking this through. I think I would like, in an ideal world, somebody with experience as a general manager before, because it's really tough to evaluate general manager candidates who are first timers. Because if you're the director of personnel at some other team, you don't really know what decisions that guy was behind. You don't really know whether he agreed with the right decisions. You don't know whether he was making bad suggestions that got vetoed. With a guy who's been a general manager in the past, at least there's a record. I think sometimes having a record works against you because people will look at like Thomas Dimitroff and they'll say, well, he drafted Tack McKinley in the 1st round. Whereas a guy who's never been a general manager before has no mistakes on his record. So it's always easy to look at the mistakes and criticize somebody over that. But I think overall Dimitroff's record is pretty good. Other aspect of this is I just don't trust Woody Johnson to scout a prospect. Woody Johnson's shown he's an abysmal judge of prospects when it comes to general managers and head coaches. So getting somebody who's done the job before, who's a more proven commodity, that's a good thing. But I also thought, you know what, it'd be nice to have somebody who's been out of the league for maybe a couple of years. Not too long. I don't want somebody who's been out of the league for 20 years, but maybe somebody who's taken a couple of years, reflected on what they could have done better, and maybe tried to improve themselves. And on the notice the Jets put out a press release indicating they had interviewed Dimitroff. Jets noted that he actually was involved in founding a sports analytics company to try and better value football players. Now, that's the kind of thing I could get behind because analytics are taking on a greater and greater role in the NFL when it comes to player evaluation going forward. So a guy who just hasn't just kind of like learned the basics, but a guy who's actually dove in head first, guy who's been part of a founding of a company to evaluate players. That's the type of thing that I could get excited about because the guy who already was a pretty solid GM. The Falcons were good more than they were bad under Dimitroff. Now there were some rough seasons in there. He finished with a 4-12 season in 2020. There were a couple other rough years along the way in Atlanta, but a guy who had his fair share of success. A guy who did a pretty good job, I think, overall. I think there was more good than bad with Thomas Dimitroff's tenure in Atlanta. Now we're talking about a guy who's taken some time off to reflect, and a guy who's learned a new part of the game, a part of the game that's going to continue to rise in significance going forward. I've talked a lot about how I think the role of the GM is changing in the NFL. How it's there's so many more departments. It's not just about pure scouting anymore. You got to think about athletic. You got to think about analytics. You got to think about sports science. You got to think about nutrition. You've got to think about managing all sorts of different things. Having a guy who's embracing these things but still has scouting sensibilities. I think that's the kind of that could be the right mix that a team like the Jets needs. So we'll see what happens. There are going to be plenty of other candidates going forward. One thing to note right now is the Jets can only interview candidates who are not working for an NFL team. League rules indicate that you cannot interview a general manager candidate until the regular season's over if he's working for an NFL team. So right now, the guys the Jets are interviewing are the John Robinsons and the Louis Riddicks and the Thomas Dimitroffs of the world who aren't working in the NFL and therefore are free to interview. There are going to be a lot more candidates we're going to see in the weeks and months ahead. Well, not the months ahead, but in the weeks ahead, we'll certainly see more candidates. So, I would not read too much into the current list. There's only 3 guys so far. Jets have indicated, and reports have indicated this is going to be a fairly exhaustive search. We're going to see plenty of candidates interview with the Jets. But Dimitroff's the latest, and I think he's a promising candidate. One thing I'll say is that there have been no ludicrous candidates right now for the Jets. All 3 of the candidates who have been listed are guys who have credentials to be NFL general managers. Which is not the case, which was not always the case in the past. When the Jets hired John Idzik, there were some questions about him. When the Jets hired Mike McCagnon, there were some questions about him. There were questions about whether these guys were qualified to be general managers. Joe Douglas, nobody questioned it. Joe Douglas didn't pan out, but nobody would really question that. You can't be, there's only so much you can do. But the first step is hiring people who are qualified to be NFL general managers. And I think the Jets have, or at least the first 3 guys the Jets are interviewing fit that description. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Tuesday. Send in your mailbag questions. Tomorrow, we'll try and do our weekly mailbag. I have to say we'll try and do our weekly mailbag now because Jets have a tendency of making headlines on Tuesdays. But if the Jets don't make headlines on this Tuesday, we'll do our weekly mailbag tomorrow. Talk to you then.